So again, thank you all for coming for the berries for wildlife class. So there are, as you can imagine, quite a bit of plants that produce berry-like fruit. And so today we're just going to focus mainly on shrubs. We really could do a whole class on trees as well, but tonight we are going to just focus on shrubs. I think it's also important that I start out with the context that when I describe berries, most of these are not true berries. So botanically, a lot of these shrubs that are producing these berry-like fruit are actually not true berries. A lot of them are what we would refer to as drupes. So just kind of know that even though I'm using the term berry, that's not a true kind of botanical definition of some of the things we're going to cover tonight. But I can tell you that we're going to refer to them as berry-like fruit, okay? Just so you can kind of get the point across here. So yeah, just wanted to start by that. All right. So before we get into particular plants, let's talk about the importance of having shrubs in our landscape. And then we'll kind of talk more in depth too on the importance of native shrubs too. So of course, first and foremost, this is going to be very common sense, but we're putting shrubs in our landscape for multiple purposes, not just because it's providing landscape value, because it's aesthetic, but for trying to attract wildlife, which could be anything from birds to large, small mammals. I'm even going to classify insects as part of this as well. You know, there are some different factors that are important when it comes to bringing these types of creatures into our landscape. So of course, number one's food, right? And we're going to kind of focus on that tonight. You know, the shrubs that are producing these berries, or they could even be producing nuts, seeds, the like, are important as a food source for this wildlife. We can also think about it in terms of flowering, how a lot of the flowers that are produced on these shrubs provide important nectar sources, especially for our insect populations. And in addition to for helping our insect populations, a lot of our insects, our Lepidoptera, for instance, our moths and butterflies, rely on plants as a larval host plant for the caterpillar stage. So a lot of those caterpillars need to be feeding on these plants, shrubs, trees, what have you, in order for them to get to the next steps in their life cycle. So that's very important, and we'll even cover a little bit of that tonight. Also, what we're going to talk about too is just the importance of shelter. Again, that seems like common sense, but a lot of wildlife need these shrubs for shelter from extreme weather events, you know, extreme wind, rain, things of that nature. And then in particular for the birds, a lot of these shrubs may provide breeding locations, as well as, most importantly, they're providing a nesting site or nesting materials for the birds to be able to properly lay their eggs and raise their young. So specifically, when we talk about planting shrubs and planting shrubs that are going to produce this berry-like fruit, here's some things to think about. It's always good to choose native over exotic. And in particularly our exotic invasive plant species, okay? Because we have a lot of those in our landscape. We have a lot of things like autumn olive, bush honeysuckle. And let me say, at first glance, you may not realize that those exotic invasives could actually be harmful. You may see birds or wildlife actually utilizing them as a food source. But something that's important to note with that, those plants aren't originally from North America, okay? And so a lot actually originate from Asia. And the reason why so many of these plant species do well here is because we have a very similar temperate climate to parts of Asia. And so they can easily overtake the landscape here because they have no pretty much natural predators like they do back home. And so what happens with that? They take over the landscape, they outcompete native species, and really the reason we especially don't like them is even if they're producing berries or food sources, a lot of times those are very low in nutrient content that it actually may not be beneficial to our wildlife and may not have enough carbohydrates or enough fat or enough nutrients, antioxidants to keep our wildlife populations, stable and healthy for surviving our winter months. In particularly, especially since we have a lot of migratory birds that come here through the fall months, especially those that are migrating down into Central America, a lot of times these exotic invasive plants, are not going to be nutritionally enough for them to survive those really long, arduous flights. So that's important to note, is even though, again, we're seeing that these plants are producing these berries like the, bush honeysuckle, for instance, it's not high enough in nutrient content to help our wildlife. So we plant native plants instead, because we know that those native plants have been around for thousands of years. They've adapted to this climate. The wildlife have adapted to these plants. And so as a result, they are used to feeding on them. And so it has the right amount of nutrients they need to get by. So just some food for thought, because sometimes we have people that will say, oh, well, this is still feeding my wildlife, but really long term, it's not going to be benefiting them. It's almost kind of like junk food, if we're being honest with you. We can kind of think of our exotic invasive plants as the junk food for our birds and mammals. And we don't want to give them junk food. We want to give them whole, enriching foods for them to survive off of. So whenever I talk about native plants, some of the number one questions I get are, what are some resources that I can find more information? And also, what are some plant nurseries that I can buy some of these plants? So I've got this covered in the next 2 slides. When it comes to native plant resources, we have our own Kentucky Native Plant Society that you can be a part of. You can look at either other extension services in nearby states, as well as states that have similar climates. Missouri Botanic Garden has a really great plant finder. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center is also an excellent resource. Even though it says wildflower, they still cover trees and shrubs. Okay. And then North Carolina, even though that does seem like a ways away, and they can have very much different types of climate zones, they have a great search engine for looking up some of these plants. And then, of course, I have to bring up some books that are on here. An oldie but a goodie is the Mary E. Wharton Trees and Shrubs of Kentucky. And that's kind of my old faithful. Even though some of the scientific names are a little bit outdated at this point, it still has some good resources for identification. And then some of you, I know our master gardeners in the room, are probably familiar with Sharon Sorensen, who really promotes a lot of planting native plants, especially for the birds. And she has a book called Planting Native to Attract Birds in Your Yard. So just a couple resources to look at. Finally, here's some native plant nurseries. Now, some of these may focus more on kind of our wildflowers, herbaceous plants, but some do get some native trees and shrubs. So ironweed, busy bee, even our Goldfinch native plant nursery, they will sometimes get, and drop seed too, will usually get some of our more woody plant species. Usually they're very limited quantities, but you can get a couple from there. Roundstone native seed, they're going to focus more on our native perennial seeds. All right. So let me delve right into the plants. Now, I, of course, have to limit how many plants I talk to you all about, or else we would be here all night. So I don't want that to do that to you. Usually I always stick to 10 plants, but in this regard, I got to 11 and like I couldn't like take one out. So we're doing 11 plants tonight that we're going to focus on. The first one, some of you, especially if you're into foraging, may be familiar with, and that's our Allegheny blackberry. Also goes by the name dewberry. Okay, so with blackberries, with that rubus genus, we have actually a lot of native blackberries found in the eastern United States. Now, when we think of our cultivated blackberries, they are very different. Usually they are hybrids of both our native blackberries and some of our more Eurasian species. So they're kind of a combination of both. So this is not the same blackberry that you're going to be growing, but this is still something you're going to see potentially in your woodlands. And I will say, if you're growing brambles, blackberries, raspberries, birds definitely do like them, although you may be growing them for you to eat. And so at that point, you may need to either have a lot of plants, or maybe you keep some bird netting on some of those, just to allow you all to be able to eat some of it. But otherwise, leave some for the birds. So with Allegheny blackberry, just like a lot of our brambles, they can spread, right? They can spread relatively easy. And so with this one, you're going to find colonies in our different woodlands. It has the very typical bramble foliage, kind of that more trifoliate. Sometimes it's palmately lobed as well. But usually the leaves are very serrated at the edges. And so you kind of can't miss. It's definitely not poison ivy. You know, a lot of times we see that trifoliate foliage and we think instantly poison ivy. But a lot of our brambles have that foliage. But with this, usually you'll see on this type of blackberry some scattered little white hairs that are on the upper leaf surface. And as with most blackberries, they develop canes, okay? And so a lot of times those canes will come out a red-purple color, and they kind of arch more as they age. And of course, they're full of prickles, as we all hate. Yes, although we have those cultivated blackberries that are thornless too. But yes, you got to watch getting into your blackberry patches. Now, we won't go too in depth because it's like a whole chapter on blackberries, but the canes for the first year are going to develop leaves, and then the second year they are going to flower and set fruit. And then typically after that second year, they will die back. So that's pretty common for these types of brambles. When they do flower, usually the flowers are white and they're 5-petaled, and they will give rise, in this case, it almost looks like a raspberry, almost looks more like the shape of a raspberry. But with these fruits, they will turn more of a purpley black color as they age. So they'll kind of start out honestly green and then red, and then they'll get into that purplish color that we're kind of used to with blackberries. Not all the plants we're going to talk about tonight are edible to humans. Let's make that clear. But you could eat this. It's very seedy, okay? And you want to watch whenever it's immature. It is not quite as sweet. You want to wait until it's fully ripened to get a little bit more of that sweet taste to it. Now, of course, with this type of fruit, and that we know wildlife generally like brambles as a whole, this is going to be very well beloved for our songbirds, to the point where, again, if we had cultivated blackberries, they would eat the whole thing, eat the whole crop. But in addition to a lot of our small mammals, rodents, foxes, raccoons, depending on where we live in the eastern US or even out in eastern Kentucky, they may be eaten by black bears as well. Occasionally we get a lone black bear that comes on this side of the state, but not very often. And in addition to that, the flowers also are good pollinator magnets for our insects. So just a few other things, a little bit of other information is even if the fruit has rotten, don't remove it, because wildlife will still utilize it. They will eat the seeds as another food source. And then two, if you just have these in your woodlands, or maybe you just have some kind of in a more wild area of your landscape, you don't have to kind of cut back those canes like you do your typical brambles. If you want to leave those dead canes up, you can, because those dead canes serve as a shelter for our bees. So our native bees will actually nest in the dead hollow stems. So if you want to try to help our native pollinators, then that's something to keep up. I think many of you know this one, American beautyberry. It's definitely a favorite. And this is a native plant that is actually pretty well in cultivation. Now there is a non-native beautyberry as well. So we're actually just talking about the American beautyberry. Surprisingly, this is in the Lamiaceae family, which is in the mint family. And if you're familiar with American beautyberry, it can, I hate to use the word spread, but it'll form pretty good thickets. So a lot of times when we find this in the landscape, they can be in thickets, open meadows, or woodlands. You can tell it's a beautyberry because it has these long arching stems. The leaves are pretty nondescript. They're really only an ovate to elliptical shaped leaf. You're not really kind of looking at that. But what you are probably looking at is late spring to early summer. They produce these lovely flower clusters. And the best thing I can describe the flower cluster is almost like flowers of like a spirea. Is they get those little clusters of anywhere from white to pink flowers. Although some of the cultivated varieties, you might get some other colors to them as well. Eventually, those colors are going to give way to the berries. They're usually produced late summer. And a lot of times they're this bluish to purplish, bright purplish color. And they kind of overtake the stem. It's like they are crowding out the stem. And so what's lovely with these is they can persist for a long time, which is really aesthetic and ornamental. This can even persist into the winter months if it's not eaten away by our wildlife. But it is a good food source for our birds and our wildlife. A lot of our birds, like the American robin, brown thrasher, purple finch, eastern towhee, which is what's on my my earring is the eastern towhee. Love the eastern towhee. They have such a lovely little song. Usually those are a good food source for them. But then interestingly, you know, again, we kind of focus on birds, and sometimes our wildlife is unwanted. I get it. I get it. Sometimes we don't want all these critters in our yard, but if you really don't care that they're there, or maybe they're far enough away into the landscape and not near your house, maybe you won't mind them as much. But things like our armadillos, because they're here, there are armadillos are here. Foxes, possum, raccoons, squirrels, all of them will eat on beauty berries. And then our white-tailed deer, They will primarily start out by browsing the leaves first, but as those leaves go away into the fall months, they will eat the fruit if there is any fruit left over. They will eat those berries if there is any around. So, and that's the one thing I'll mention with a lot of these plants, they will be chewed on by deer, but generally these plants can take it. Okay, it's usually not a death sentence. Usually a lot of these shrubs can be browsed on by deers and still bounce back. Now, of course, if you've got a ridiculous population, then your plants may have some issues. If that's the case where you have a huge population, then you may want to consider kind of caging or fencing around these shrubs to protect them from the deer, because you don't want them to just totally nibble down the shrub completely that there's nothing left. So a little bit's okay, but when you have a high population, then it can be problematic. Viburnum, there's a lot of viburnums. Viburnums in general are really great shrubs. We have a lot of native viburnums. Even some of our cultivated viburnums are still really good pollinator plants, as well as producing berries for wildlife too. So I'll say this, you can't go wrong with a viburnum, honestly. Now, this one in particular is called arrowwood viburnum. It's a little bit more liked by some of our bird species than the others. So this is found primarily in more moist areas of our woodlands, our moist woods along streams, but it has more of an upright multi-stemmed habit. The leaves themselves can be a little bit dark green to glossy in appearance. But what we notice and what we love most about viburnums is the flower clusters that they produce. And boy, do they produce beautiful flower clusters. And even some of our cultivated varieties have some very fragrant ones too, that you could like just smell it from several feet away. Now, those flower clusters are going to appear primarily in the spring months, and then they're going to give way to the fruit. In this case, you're going to see more of a bluish black drupe in late summer. And I'll start off by saying it's very common for viburnums for their berries to also color change a little bit, where they may also start out kind of more of a reddish color, and then they'll mature to more of this bluish purple black coloration later. Now, why these are so good is because this is a fruit that is very well balanced in nutrients. It's high in fats, high in carbohydrates, very high in antioxidants. Everything you need, especially for our migratory birds, for their long flights south, as well as some of our other songbird species, grouse, our wild turkeys, things like that. This is also, again, browsed by deer, but again, usually they're going to be eating the twigs and the leaves as opposed to the fruit, usually just as a last resort. Because even some of these shrubs that we'll talk about, sometimes all animals can eat the fruit, and other times really just the birds have the stomach for the fruit and they're otherwise toxic for everything else. So it really just kind of depends on the shrub itself. This is also, viburnums in general are also good larval host plants for things like our azure butterflies. So our pretty little blue butterflies, usually their caterpillar will feed on viburnums. All right, this is a controversial one, and I'll kind of get into why it's a little controversial. But let me start out by explaining what the plant is, its characteristics, and then we'll kind of talk about it a little bit. So, black chokeberry. Don't confuse this by the next plant because we have a chokecherry. We have a chokeberry and we have a chokecherry, and they're two totally different species, different genus even of plants, okay? So we don't want to get them confused. They are both in the Rosaceae family, the rose family, but they are still different, very different genetically. We have actually two types of chokeberries. We have the red chokeberry and the black chokeberry. Specifically, this one is the black chokeberry. It's going to be quite a spreader. It spreads easily through suckers. Usually we're going to see this in more moist areas as well. The foliage is very glossy in appearance, and it's going to produce clusters of those little 5-petal flowers. Generally, they're going to be a white color, and then they'll give way to the blackish purple berries in late summer. So the flowers are great for both the red chokeberry and the black chokeberry for attracting pollinators. Really great for that. All right, let's talk about why this is controversial. If you have these in your landscape, or maybe you have them somewhere in your woods, on your farm, what have you, you may notice that birds don't touch them. And you're probably like, why the heck is it on here? Because birds don't tend to eat these. Well, this is why we have it on here. Generally, birds will not come to the chokeberries unless it's a last resort. And so generally, these berries still persist into the winter months because the birds are feasting on everything else. But then once everything else is gone, once all the other food sources are gone and depleted, then they're going to come to these. And so as a result, even though birds don't prefer these are still a good food source for birds really late into the winter months. Okay, that is why it's still good to have these, because initially when you're looking at them and you're like, well, nothing's eating them. Well, it's called chokeberry for a reason. It's very astringent. It's very tart. It's not real sweet. And it's so astringent to the point where you could easily choke. It actually is edible for people. Both the black chokeberry and red chokeberry are edible for people to eat. A lot of times people will make those into jams or jellies. Of course, because you're adding a ridiculous amount of sugar to them to kind of get rid of that taste, that tart taste. But again, going back to the birds, they will still go to these as a late food source when everything else is gone. Now, the question is, do they prefer the black chokeberry or the red chokeberry? There's a lot of conflicting information on this. From what I've kind of gathered, birds will tend to prefer the black chokeberry over the red. But opposite of that, what's interesting, humans prefer the red chokeberry over the black chokeberry. So different depending on what kind of animal you are. So I put the black chokeberry over the red one on here just because it seems like, from what sources are kind of saying, that birds may prefer this one slightly over the red, slightly. But with that said, they'll still eat both, and they'll eat those later. Anyway, so that's my controversial one. All right, let's go to the chokecherry. I know, so much. This is where you want to rely on scientific names to help you with figuring out what these plants are. So chokecherry is a prunus. And so that might help you a little bit with the cherry name because other cherries are in the genus Prunus. But again, still Rosaceae family. And the flower, the plant itself does look quite a bit different from our actual chokeberries. So with the chokecherry, this can actually somewhat be a decent ornamental. A lot of times this can be a medium to large shrub into even a small tree, and it's going to form pretty dense thickets to the point where if you need a good privacy screen, that may be your option here. Now, when it comes to the plant itself, though, some characteristics about it. is it will produce, again, the eggs are pretty the leaves are pretty nondescript. They're kind of more of an egg shaped. But how you can kind of tell it's a choke cherry is if you were to crush them, they have a very bitter smell to them whenever you crush them, which is completely opposite of the flowers themselves. When it produces the flowers, which are kind of these lovely semi-spikes of flowers, generally white, they're actually a very pleasant, fragrant smell, very pleasant smell. Now, eventually, these flowers are going to give way to the fruit, kind of these loose berries, and they are going to start out red again, and then they're going to turn black when they're ripe. This is also a very bitter taste, hence why it also has the name choke cherry. Even though I've heard of people using this plant in different recipes, I don't think I would recommend it because pretty much all parts of this plant are toxic because they contain cyanide. So I wouldn't, I mean, even if the berries are slightly better, the seeds and the berries contain the cyanide. And so it's not something I would try. Plus, it doesn't taste good and it could result in choking. It could make you potentially sick. So I would avoid eating the choke cherry. Now, with that said, wildlife, birds actually like this. So again, we're talking about birds they can stomach this, okay? Better than people or even other wildlife can. So they're going to be eating the fruits and seeds of the choke cherry. Now, when it comes to other things, wildlife aren't really going to touch the berries either, like mammals, although sometimes, if you have some real hungry deer, they may nibble on the twigs. But again, this should be relatively deer resistant because of its toxicity. But again, if they're hungry enough, they could actually mess with it. Now, just some other points to the choke cherry. It's a larval host plant for our eastern tiger swallowtail. So our tiger swallowtail will use other plants as a host plant as well. But if you're not familiar, our eastern tiger swallowtail is our beautiful yellow and black butterfly, as my son calls it. It's like yellow and black butterfly. He gets so excited because yellow is like one of his favorite colors, and he sees that butterfly and he just adores it. So it's a good host plant for that. And it also provides good nesting material for our bird populations as well. Elderberry. I feel like a broken record for some of you that have come to my other classes, my medicinal botany class, my indigenous uses of native plants class. Elderberry is one that I've added quite a bit, so you can kind of think of it more like a really impactful plant, and that's because it is. So for those of you not familiar with elderberry, we do have native elderberry that's found here in Kentucky. Usually it's found along kind of more moist areas, but you may also see this even off the parkway, if I'm being honest with you. In ditches, it can kind of grow just about anywhere. It's pretty easy going for that matter. But it'll form thickets. It's native, but it can be aggressive. And so if you are planting elderberry for maybe other reasons other than wildlife, maybe you want to just grow the berries and harvest them yourselves, just know you need to allow plenty of space for this plant because it could potentially take over. You really can't misidentify it. It is forming these thick thickets, and it has these very much compound leaves to them. Then it produces those pretty heavy clusters. They'll start out by being small white flowers, and then they'll give way to this drupe that's more of a purple black color. Now, before I get into the wildlife part, even though We're talking about berries for wildlife to eat. I do want to kind of give a disclaimer here about if you are going to be harvesting the berries yourself. Never eat the raw berries. Okay, never eat the raw berries. That's very important. Raw unripe berries could give you a pretty heavy tummy ache. So the chemical compound that's in elderberry, whenever it's digested, will break down in your body like cyanide. Okay, so it's not to scare you, but you will want to cook your elderberries. Okay, so if you're going to make any kind of elderberry jam, pie, make a syrup, make an elderberry tea, of course, cooking, boiling down the ripened berries is very important. So then you don't have to have severe digestive distress as a result. All right. With that said, wildlife can certainly eat these a little bit better. They can stomach them a little bit better. A lot of our songbirds will eat elderberries. A lot of our mammals will eat them. And then also something that's really good is our birds will nest in elderberries and those branches, and our native bees will nest in those hollow stems. So I know, again, we kind of are tricked in our minds a little bit where we see a dead stem, whether it's a tree or shrub. Immediately we want to prune it back. We want to cut it back just because that's something that's kind of ingrained in our heads. Really, if it's not hurting anybody, you don't care how it looks, then leave it. Because again, a lot of our insect populations really rely on those hollow pieces of wood in order to nest or kind of survive our cold months. So just something to consider, something to think about. All right, blueberry. I'm going to have a whole class on blueberries in the spring. And actually, high bush blueberries, not only are they native, but we also will grow. We have many different cultivated varieties of blueberries. Trust me, they've been hybridized quite a bit, but they do originate from our native high bush blueberries. Okay. I love blueberries, not just because they're in the Ericaceae family, the Ericaceae family. That's surprisingly not my favorite family, but I have to brag on that, whenever I see it. But we'll go very much more in depth on growing blueberries later, but for the purposes of this class, let's just kind of talk about the plant and why wildlife really like this. So these are an upright multi-stemmed shrub. A lot of times this is going to be found either in moist areas near bogs and swamps, or sometimes we'll even find these in more high elevation woodlands as well. As some of you who have grown blueberries probably know, they are acid loving. So they need to have very acidic soil. So generally, around a 4.5 to 5.2 pH range, that's highly acidic because most of our other plant species prefer to grow within a 6 to 7 pH, with the pH of 7 being more neutral zone. Okay. And so when we're growing blueberries, we have to give them acidic conditions. So where these are probably growing are going to be in high acidic soil. So just something to keep in mind there. So with these, I find these to be a very aesthetic plant. They're very pretty, especially when it comes to the foliage. So when you start to get that spring tender growth, it's going to come out initially as more of a reddish color, and then it'll go more into a deeper green color the more you get into the late spring and summer months. They're going to produce usually at some point in the spring, depending on the species that you have. Again, we're particularly talking about our high bush, but it will produce these lovely, cute, adorable little bell-shaped flower clusters. They're generally pink to white in color, and you can kind of see how they resemble then the fruit that is produced afterwards, which is our actual blueberry, when we think of a true blueberry. So the flowers, really great nectar source for pollinators. If you're growing blueberries just in general as a crop, you probably get a ton of bees that flock to the blueberries. But not only for our honeybees, it's a very important plant for our native bee population as well. I have down here supports specialized bees. So generally when I mean specialized bees, these are native, often solitary species of bees that rely on particular species of plants to survive. Okay, and if that plant species is gone, then that bee is probably gone as well. And so that's kind of another important reason why we want to have more of a diverse landscape with some of these native plants is we want to help our native bee populations. Because again, if we don't have the plants, then those bees could easily become extinct. When it comes to other pollinators, this is the larval host plant of the brown elfin butterfly, this little brown butterfly. And then in addition, the fruit, oh my, well, we all love blueberries, right? I mean, it's almost like, I don't even have to tell you how much wildlife loves the fruit. And usually the wildlife's going to come eat your blueberries before you have a chance to get your blueberries. A lot of times, you'll probably look at your blueberry bush and be like, oh, it needs another day. It needs another day. But then you wait another day and then it's all gone. That's generally what happens is you wait a day too late and then everything eats it. So again, it's really good for our wildlife, as you can see from this list here. So what I'll say, if you're growing this, have some plants for the wildlife and then have some plants for yourself. So for the plants for yourself, again, if you need to put up some kind of, bird netting or caging to protect them, you can do that. But for the most part, wildlife are going to eat at this very much so. You will also want to be mindful because these are eaten by deer and rabbits too. So again, if you're using it as a crop, keep that in mind for wildlife control. All right, possum haw holly. So we have native species of holly, both shrubs and trees. We have non-native Asian species of holly. Most of them are producing those beautiful bright red berries. In the case of this possum haw holly, this is a deciduous holly where with its foliage, it's going to lose its foliage, but the berries that it produces are going to persist into the fall and winter months. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with hollies, they're what we consider dioecious, meaning that there are both male and female plants. And so if you want to get those berries, guess what? You got to have both, okay? You got to get the male plants to pollinate the female plants, and then the female plants are going to eventually give way to those beautiful red-orange berries. I remember growing up, before I ever knew anything about plants, okay? My neighbor had 5 hollies. And I always thought, I observed this as a child, it was weird that the holly on the very end never produced berries. I always thought, and I asked my parents, I'm like, why does that holly not have berries and the other ones do? And of course, my parents knew nothing about plants. They didn't know there were male or female hollies. They only grew tomatoes. And so I didn't learn that till later on into my education that that was the case. And so more than likely that was the male holly that was helping to fertilize all those other female hollies that were producing the berries. So just something to know, if you have a holly, it's never produced berries, it needs a companion, okay? It needs a partner. So when it comes to the berries, this is eaten by birds and other mammals. It may not always be the more preferred meal of our bird and mammal species, but kind of like the choke berries, they will eat this when there's nothing else around. Okay. So generally you might actually get some really ornamental, nice color on those berries for a while before wildlife then comes in and pretty much strips it. So, but in general, it's a really good ornamental shrub. And with this holly, this will also support larval host caterpillars of our different butterfly species, as well as our specialized bees too. All right, serviceberry. I had to put this in here, not just one particular species. And with serviceberries, they generally fall into the shrub to tree. And, you know, again, we're kind of focusing on more shrubs. I kind of consider this also could be a shrub. So even though we might think of it as an understory tree in our woodlands, but it's here. And the reason why, especially I bring it up, is just because if you want to talk about a plant that is like the superfood for all wildlife, this is it. Okay, this is our rock star. So before we get into that, though, the serviceberry, it's often either a multi-trunk shrub or a small tree. Usually, a lot of times we may see it as an understory sometimes in our woodlands, although it won't tend to bloom as well if it's too shaded. A lot of times we don't even see this tree unless we're actually out there, because unfortunately, it's generally blooming around the same time as our Bradford pears. And sometimes if we're not plant people and we don't pay attention, we may think it's just a random Bradford pear somewhere when it's actually a serviceberry if we're not looking at it up close. So unfortunately, oftentimes it gets overshadowed. Now, I will also say it's not to be mistaken by our flowering dogwoods. Generally, this is going to bloom before our dogwoods do. And we have a dogwood we'll talk about next. But whenever they do bloom, there are these lovely little drooping flowers, and they're small, and they're in these little white clusters. They have a light fragrance to them. They're very short-lived. They're really not going to last very long. Generally, these flowers are going to appear before the foliage does. Sometimes the foliage will come on right as the flowers are ending, and it also depends on the species of serviceberry as well. But after the flowers occur in the early spring, they will produce this berry-like fruit. It's going to start out green in color, then it's going to turn red, then it's going to be more of a blue or black coloration. And it honestly almost resembles a little blueberry, kind of shaped like a little blueberry. Now, this is why I have it on here. So for birds, for butterflies, this is a really important plant. So with the berries it produces, they kind of estimate that over 40 bird species will feed on serviceberries. That's pretty significant. Whereas with some of the other plants we're talking about, maybe 10, 20, this is 40. That's substantial for how many birds actually prefer this plant. And then also, not only that, this is almost like an outrageous number, okay? Our Lepidoptera, our moths and butterflies, over 120 species feed on this tree. Whether it's used as a nectar source for our lepidopterans or it's used as a larval host plant. It's even used with a lot of our native bee species. That's pretty substantial. And so when I see this, it makes me think, We need to plant more service berries, right? Big time. And especially when we're thinking about alternatives to our landscape. Maybe we have had Bradford pear trees and maybe we are trying to get rid of them, but maybe you still want a tree or a shrub, if you will, that produces those early spring white flowers. This is a good alternative for you. And it's not going to have nearly as much in the ways of pests and diseases like a lot of our dogwood trees are experiencing right now. So just kind of food for thought there. Also, this is for you, Scott Deal. That can be used as a jam or jelly. So I totally expect you, Scott, to come back to me and make this, find a service berry and make it into a jam or jelly for me to try later. So that's your assignment. You made a pie. See, there we go. Next time we got a taste test, the jams and jellies and pies. So yes, so this is edible, so we can use it for our advantage too. So it's actually, I would still kind of put it in more of a partial sun location, but it will actually bloom better and produce more fruit and more sun conditions. Yes, yes. Yeah, you gotta watch because sometimes the summer heat could be a little bit much for it. But if you're putting it in, say, like more of an eastern exposure where it's getting more of that bright morning sun, it's going to do pretty well compared to maybe a little bit of that afternoon. That might be a little bit harsh for it in the summer, but it could survive that condition. So silky dogwood. So we're talking about a dogwood shrub, okay? We have plenty of dogwood shrubs and trees. We're going to focus on silky dogwood. So this is a medium to large shrub. A lot of times we're going to find silky dogwood in more moist conditions, kind of along swamps and in wetlands. It's a good wetland plant. You can tell it's a silky dogwood compared to other dogwoods because it has almost like these little fine silky hairs along the leaves and the twigs. Just like other dogwoods, the leaves are more of an opposite arrangement. These will produce clusters of these white flowers in the spring. So it is aesthetic, and you can keep silky dogwood as a relatively okay ornamental too. It produces these clusters of these lovely white flowers, and then they're going to give way in the later summer, those really pretty kind of bluish purple droops on here. And so dogwoods in general are really good for birds and pollinators. They're going to enjoy the flowers. The insects will for nectar, but then the berries themselves are going to be eaten by quite a few different kinds of songbirds. Really just about any kind of wildlife you can imagine is going to feed on this. So our turkey, black bears, foxes, white-tailed deer, they're all going to feed on this plant. Now, something to think about with dogwoods it may be inflicted by some heavy deer damage. So this might be one you may want to potentially kind of cage or have a fence around, just because it could be browsed to the point by deer where it could really harm young plants. So just kind of watch that. And dogwoods they just don't always bounce back as easily as some of our other native trees and shrubs. So
I guess got it at one of these things that was given away stuff and planted it next to inside my fence. Forgot it was there and along with the weed eater.
Did you? Oh no.
It came back like 2 or 3 months.
Was it a silky or was it a different type of dogwood?
It's supposed to be a silky.
Okay.
I think, according to the picture, this is Anyway.
Well, there you go.
Hardier than it might.
Maybe it's a little bit more durable than we give it credit for, so.
Crops. But it has similar whiteberries, gray dog.
Yes. Mhm.
Same about that.
Yes, and those berries are beautiful.
Gray dog, whiteberries.
Yes,
Oh, you can tell them apart.
I know, is by the coloration, otherwise, yeah, they look very similar.
This one, and the, they call it the red. Osier.
Oh, the red osier
And
dogwood?
the lovely, and that is shrub also.
Mhm, yeah.
And are they all about the same beneficial? Or this is the.
Most dogwoods, I would say, are. I mean, I can't say that 100%, but I feel like most of our native dogwoods that I know of always are host plants for different kinds of butterflies. And then always, it seems like any kind of bird will go to the berries of a lot of those dogwoods. So I would say if you plant any of them, they're going to be beneficial. So for sure. Let's end on this last one on our spice bush, because we see this quite a bit in our woodlands, and you can grow these as well. I've got one just in my general landscape that actually does very well. And so with spice bush, of course, we call it spice bush because if you were to crush the leaves, and that's always a fun like Boy Scout project or Girl Scout project, or just if you're taking your kids, they always love it whenever you just kind of grab a leaf and you crush it and it just smells really strong. Kind of that spicy, almost cinnamony aroma to it. Otherwise, it's kind of a not like a nondescript bush. Maybe people don't like it for ornamental, so to speak. But of course, with this plant, you know, there's so many positive things about this for our pollinators, for our birds, that I would recommend everyone keep spice bush if they could in their landscapes. So with spice bush, these are also dioecious plants. So again, similar to the hollies, we have our male and female plants. Now, if they're fertilized, we have the little yellow flowers that will give way to the fruit. And the fruit is also kind of just as spicy smelling as the foliage. And usually that's going to come a little bit later into the summer months. Why this is a really good one is because with these berries, they have very high fat content. And that fat content is important for our fall migratory birds. And so we have so much of this in the woodlands. By all means, please, you know, keep them there. You know, don't like bulldoze your woodlands. Don't remove these. Leave them there or plant some more because this is a really great food source as our birds head south. It's also just good in general for our other bird species as well. And then, of course, putting birds aside, it's a good larval food source for our spice bush swallowtail, where it gets its name. And then it gets a cute little caterpillar. Look at that little guy. He's so cute. I love caterpillars. I think they're adorable, especially this guy, because it looks like he has those big eyes, but they're not real eyes. But he kind of gets more of this. He can be green and also get kind of more orangey color too, just depending on the life stage of it. What is it? Oh, I can kind of see where you get that from. But yeah, this is the caterpillar of the spice bush swallowtail. So yeah, Beverly.
I've seen this in woods.
Mine grows in full sun. Yeah.
They never know.
They never know. Exactly. Yep. It's a guessing game. No, it's true because especially with a lot of our nurseries, they're also pretty small to the point where it's like you're not gonna know. And honestly, it's like I just have mine. I've not seen mine bloom at all yet either, but I leave them be just for the purposes of at least they'll be eaten by the caterpillar. Yeah. So, yeah, so I mean, if we know that there are male and female plants, if we have both, then of course that's great for the berries. But if not, at least we can still grow them for the caterpillars to feed off of. So, yeah, that's kind of why I keep mine around. So, yeah. But yeah, that's the only thing with this one. And in the woodlands, you've got so much around. But whenever you're just buying these, I mean, I've never seen a grower, any one of our native plant growers actually say this is a male or a female. So unfortunately. Really, you're not gonna probably be able to tell unless you look at the flowers later on. If you see the flowers, yeah. And then you see if they've got, they're producing the pollen or not, so.
Erica, I studied the possum home flowers.
Mhm.
Those trees in my woods farm. And all of them look like they have pistils, but I figured out that some of them are not producing pollen. I mean, they're there, you can see them, but they look a little bit different at the top. So, but they're still considered dioecious, even though both trees have pistils. I mean, the stamens.
Are the stamens just sterile with some of
Yeah, I
those?
think the stamens, the one that the persimmon is that one too.
Yeah, the persimmon is like
Even
that
though we
too.
still call it dioecious.
Yeah. Yeah, I do know that with persimmons. That's interesting with the hollies though, too, that
Yeah,
they have
I mean,
that.
I'm not my trees that this one doesn't have any berries on it, but
Mhm.
it blooms.
Yeah,
It's the male. Does have to do.
yeah, because the males will still, it's like the males still produce the flowers. They need to produce the flowers for that pollen, so. Mm-hmm. Oh,
I tell them apart. I can't. Hard to tell them apart.
no. I tell them apart later when I see which ones are producing the berries and which ones aren't. Finish our talk for tonight, and then hopefully I will see you all for our future talks too. So again, especially for our most recent one coming up, that's the conifers and evergreens on December 1st. All right. Thank you all. Have a good night. And I